Okay, I think you're ready to start. Welcome to the TNFD Forum Webinar named Change in the State of Nature, the Next Generation of Metrics and Targets. We are very pleased to have you here with us today. I'm Renata Pollini, the Head of Nature at Holcim, and a member of the TNFD. I'm going to be moderating today's panel. But before we get started, there are a couple of housekeeping points I would like to share. Next slide, please. The first one is that today's session, the next one, please. So the first one is that today's session is being recorded, and it will be sent to you in the next Forum Insights newsletter. For the best view experience, we recommend putting Zoom into a speaker view using the button in the top right corner of your screen. You can write your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can also vote to the questions you would like to see answered. I'm also delighted to welcome today's panel. We have brilliant speakers with unique knowledge, which is very exciting. The first panelist is Varsha Vijay. Varsha is the technical director at the Science Based Target Network. She's a quantitative scientist with expertise across biodiversity, land use, data modeling, monitoring, and corporate supply chains. In addition to technical expertise, she has direct experience working on justice and equity, on conservation to develop solutions with a diverse group of collaborators and stakeholders across the markets, governments, and civil society. The next speaker is Thomas Brooks. Thomas is chief scientist at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the so-called IUCN, based in Gland, Switzerland. His responsibilities include scientific support to the delivery of knowledge products under IUCN standards, such as the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, maintaining IUCN interactions with peer scientific institutions, and strengthening the union's culture of science. The next one is Warwick Mostert. Warwick is part of the Anglo-American group, bringing over 25 years of biodiversity and conservation management experience across different companies, business units, and functions. He has been central to the development and implementation of Anglo-Americans' ambitious targets and commitments to net positive impact and delivery of positive biodiversity outcomes. And he continues working, deliver a sustainable future for mining. And the last one is Liudmila Strakadonskaya. Liudmila is an ESG analyst at ASCA Investment Management. She began her career in 2016, working as a sustainable investment analyst for ET Finance, specializing in ESG climate-related analysis and reporting. She then joined Eliva Capital as an ESG specialist in 2019, where she developed an ESG strategy for the company and represented them to the UN Principles for Responsible Investments. The first presentation we will hear today is going to be from Varsha, from SBTN. Over to you, Varsha.
Thank you so much, Renata, for that introduction. Next slide, please. So I want to talk today about the methodology that SBTN is developing. For a little bit of an introduction into SBTN, we're a coalition of more than 50 NGO partners, including many other organizations that work on addressing nature impacts like IUCN and UNEP WCMC. We're working to develop a methodology to ensure that individual actors are staying in an environmentally safe and a socially just operating space. To do this, we leverage the best available science and data on pressures and changes in the state of nature, and align with global goals like the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. The work of SBTN builds on SBTI, our partner organization, on climate targets to create a holistic methodology for target setting, reflecting the fact that climate is deeply connected to all aspects of nature. This approach creates incentives for stronger voluntary and policy action for nature and climate, leveraging co-benefits. Next, please. We utilize a high-level framework for companies to assess, prioritize, measure, address, and track their impacts on nature in line with science. So just to walk you briefly through this high-level framework, in step 1, companies assess their materiality and map their value chain, essentially allowing them to understand their impacts with respect to what nature needs. In step 2, the company is going to identify their sphere of influence and prioritize locations for action. In step 3, the company is going to set targets and measure their baseline and develop a monitoring plan eventually. Step 4 is their actions. So this is essentially taking the target and deciding what the company must do. And finally, in step 5 of this framework, companies are going to track that progress by monitoring, reporting, and verifying their targets. Next slide, please. Our version 1 of our methods, which will be released in Q1 of 2023, represents a subset of the overall methodology we hope to eventually release, covering multiple realms, so freshwater, land, and oceans, and biodiversity eventually. Crucially for this discussion, the methods outline both which metrics are appropriate for setting targets to address impacts in nature, and also how to do this. So we emphasize the need for the metrics or indicators used to fit to the specific target and proposed actions being considered. So within the methodology we'll be releasing, companies will learn how to use methodologies, tools, and guidance to provide a pathway towards target setting. And that's what companies who are entering the SBTN target setting process will see. As time goes on, this approach allows us to iterate and incorporate new developments in the science, new metrics and new data, which you're going to hear some of my other fellow panelists speak about, in order to better represent both impacts on nature and the ways in which companies can address those impacts through actions which mitigate their negative impacts and also increase their positive impacts on nature towards a goal of nature positive. Next, please. Finally, as a core knowledge partner of TNFD, we're working on mutual technical development in the path to our overall guidance for companies. As you can see in this diagram here, we're working together with the TNFD technical team to identify how companies which parallelly apply the SBTN methodologies, again to be released in Q1 of 2023 for the first version, alongside the TNFD beta framework. There are parts of each approach which can be used to capitalize on the work done by the companies. So what you'll see in that right-hand side of the diagram is that companies that apply the SBTN framework will actually be on the pathway to completing the requirements for part of the TNFD requirements. As we approach this Q1 2023 release, we'll be working with the TNFD team to ensure that our guidance for companies emphasizes these places of alignment and also explains the differences between our core fundamental assumptions of our methodologies. And that's it for me. Thank you so much, and I look forward to receiving questions during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Varsha. Very, very powerful messages in there. In particular, I like the structure and systematic approach SBTN is taking to guide companies to set targets, but in a science-based way. The next speaker is Thomas Brooks from IUCN. Over to you, Thomas.
Thanks so much, Renata. Good day, everybody. Renata, I know that IUCN and Holcim work together on a number of things, and so it's great to have a chance to interact with you directly here. And thanks in turn to TNFD for convening this really timely webinar, which brings together a number of important and topical threads. One particularly important element of this timeliness is the fact that the world's governments, touch wood, will finalize this December what's being called the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which, as the Paris Agreement has done for climate change, is anticipated to bring nature fully into mainstream economic decision-making. However, for this to happen, we have to be able to measure biodiversity, or more specifically, risks and opportunities to biodiversity. And so my comments in this panel are going to focus on progress towards such measurement. Next slide, please. The challenge, of course, is that biodiversity is a complex and multi-dimensional concept, much more so than, for example, climate change. Moreover, biodiversity varies dramatically over space around the world, and so it's essential that metrics place biodiversity risk and opportunity in the context of global significance, not just local significance, which has been the case with many metrics used to date. Happily, though, we do have a universally recognized definition of biodiversity itself from the Convention on Biological Diversity, which gives us a crucial clue as to how we need to go about measuring it in its final clause, which highlights that we need to consider biodiversity across 3 distinct levels of ecological organization: for genetic diversity, for species, and for entire ecosystems. For ecosystems and for genetic diversity, much work is underway, for example, through the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems thematic group, to develop such metrics of global significance. And these could actually make a good focus for a future TNFD webinar. For today, though, I'm going to focus on measuring risk and opportunity for biodiversity at the species level. Next slide, please. For more than 5 decades now, we've had a powerful metric of biodiversity risk available for individual species in the form of the IUCN Red List. However, the enduring question has been, how can these data be synthesized into a metric of risk and opportunity applicable across scales and anywhere around the world? Last year, this challenge was finally solved by Dr. Louise Mayer from the University of Newcastle in formulating a species threat abatement and restoration metric. This synthesizes data from thousands of species, from groups within which every species has been assessed for the Red List, to measure the potential contribution towards reducing global extinction risk to background rates, which could come from specific conservation or restoration actions in specific places. It's available at 5 square kilometers globally, and while currently focused on terrestrial vertebrate species, is in the process of being expanded to include marine and freshwater species, and an application for plants has just been accepted for publication. Importantly, STAR is wholly additive, not just over space, but also among actions, among threats and actions. So it can be broken down according to opportunity offered in a specific place, for example, actions to increase agricultural sustainability or to mitigate invasive alien species impacts, or so on. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. These properties of STAR make it suitable for measuring potential contributions towards global goals for species from the full range of different actors and actions, including in the private and financial sectors, as with the examples shown here, and we'll hear some more about such contexts from Warwick and Liudmila in a minute. The current focus of such applications is on risk and opportunity disclosure and on planning activities such as the establishment of science-based targets, very much further to Varsha's earlier comments. The use of STAR for risk assessment specifically addresses the link between company activities across their footprint and the threats to species that apply within that footprint. If a company's actions in their footprint are likely to be increasing these risks, for instance, if food commodity sourcing is linked to a loss of habitat, then that in turn provides a risk of a very specific character to the company. But it's also an opportunity, as indicated in the private finance example in the infographic here, where the transformation from commercial agriculture to sustainable farming yields a specific number of STAR units. Moreover, methods are under development to also support monitoring and reporting progress, the so-called calibrated and realized versions of STAR. The metric is already in use in the IUCN Contributions for Nature platform and in the emerging IUCN Nature Positive approach, and it's available for commercial use through the integrated biodiversity assessment tool via the URL down in the bottom right-hand corner there. Final slide, please. I'd like to finish with a little final slide. I'd like to finish with a little bit of a plug, but one which is highly relevant to the context of discussion here. From the 13th till the 15th of October, IUCN, along with the Korean Minister of Environment and Jeju Self-Governing Province, and in partnership with TNFD, will convene a leaders forum on building nature-positive economies and societies. I think that this Leaders Forum offers an important opportunity to continue many of the discussions that we'll be having through this webinar, and so I look forward to seeing many of you there. Thanks so much again, and back to you, Renata.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Well, very insightful. I think two key takeaways from my side. First thing is I really like what you mentioned, that biodiversity is really a local issue or local challenge, but also opportunity, but we should look at in the global level. I think this will help us to prioritize our actions. I really like this insight. And the next one is to see the methodology STAR as a methodology which can help corporations to identify the risk assessment, but also the opportunities that they may have in the field. So I really like it. Next speaker is Warwick from Anglo American. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Renata. And thanks, Thomas, for a lead into this, because a lot of what about is exactly, in the application of the STAR metric. Thank you. You can go to the next slide. And as Thomas was saying earlier, I don't have to repeat it in terms of we all know just how complex biodiversity is, and as much as we would like the one sort of ring to rule them all approach of about one metric, we know that that's almost impossible. But what we do need to do is to make sure that the metrics can try and simplify some of the complexity within biodiversity. And I mean, if you just look at that tree of life, I think on the right-hand side, there's only a very small portion of that which we traditionally get out of monitoring. And so, there's a lot more that we can be using in terms of picking up around targets and metrics. And one of the approaches that we've applied over the last probably 18 months together with nature metrics is the application of eDNA or environmental DNA. One of the real sort of beauties of this is that it can give you an incredible amount of big data that you can get very easily. You don't necessarily need to have the specialist in-field expertise that traditionally has gone with a lot of the biodiversity assessments that have happened. And so any of your staff, no matter what company you might be in, can very easily collect a sample and have it analyzed based on the extraction method. What it does do, and what we found, is it also very importantly, it augments a lot of the baseline and the reference libraries that in some countries are very good, but as we know, in a lot of states and a lot of countries are lacking. And so the whole idea is to make sure that we can support those reference library and build them up, and particularly when it comes down to barcoding and the point that Thomas was making around the species, and getting them uplisted if that is the necessary way in terms of some of those species assessments. What it also does, as I was saying, it's an incredibly easy method, and so your traditional safety, health, and environment staff on site can take these samples very easily, but it also gives you an opportunity to identify very early on what some of those, yes, risks, but also what we're trying to pull out is more on the opportunity side. And it also helps to detect some of those species that are incredibly difficult to pick up, and you would not normally be able to get them through the traditional sampling methods. What we're trying to do now together with Nature Metrics is to see whether we can adapt this kind of approach using eDNA to augment our net positive impact commitment and importantly, be able to report on our progress to do that. And a lot of it has been, building on the traditional baseline surveys that have been conducted, but now using the data that we're getting out of the eDNA surveys to support that. And then ultimately we can make some of those early decisions around where we need to intervene, and probably where a lot of the metrics discussion is going, and around some of the nature positive outcomes and that discussion is going, is to say where should we be getting involved in some of these landscape initiatives that we can potentially use an application like eDNA. So just the next slide, just a couple of high-level results. So we've been running a series of pilots around 15 of our sites globally. We try to get a real mix, so we've actually adapted it from a terrestrial right through to the marine environment. To date, this is just the first season sampling. We've collected over 1,600 samples that have been taken, and just some high-level results that have been received to date. You can just see some of the figures there, and I was saying, incredibly easy to get this done. The Naturemetrics team ship out the kits globally, very easy to get it to site. The site then obviously goes through the process of collecting the samples, and it gets back and analyzed in a turnaround time. And this is the amount of data that you can get from literally a first season. So the application we're looking at now is to see how we can use this data, and more importantly, share it, make sure that it is available and feeds into a potential metric and a tool like the STAR metric, where we are finding where potentially we have some data deficient species. We can actually potentially get them uplifted based on the fact of the results that we've been getting to date from some of the eDNA surveys. The next slide, if you wouldn't mind. So this obviously then is important for us. And so together with IUCN and the Naturemetrics team, we partnered around the eBioAtlas program. And the intention is to make sure that we can use, and at the moment, it's obviously aquatic-based samples. The idea is that it'll get expanded to potentially some soil sediments. And so, that obviously has just got a huge potential to increase just the coverage that you can get out of this type of methodology. As said before, it's incredibly easy to apply. You don't need to be a specialist at all. And the whole idea is that we can put these kits and make them available to not only companies, but also to local stakeholders, and in particular, some of the citizen science work that we've been doing to enable the collection of the data. The whole idea, a bit like a sort of GBIF platform, is to make sure that this data is open sourced and available. And sadly, a lot of companies and a lot of specialist studies have been done, your traditional EIA surveys, but none of that information ever gets to be publicly available. And some of it might get published, yes, but the irony is that there's a lot of this that is still sitting that doesn't get shared. And so the intention of the eBioAtlas program is to make sure that this data is available, and we've committed to make sure that the data and the samples that we've collected on our sites is available and is uplifted, and it is in the process of being uplifted to the portal. There's obviously going to be a digital infrastructure which goes together with this that can then help be aligned and informed with some of the work that's needed to develop these metrics and targets that we need, that are coming out through TNFD, and some of the disclosures that companies are obviously going to be asked to do. And so there's not only us, there are a number of obviously implementing partners that are helping us along this process, and together with a couple of other business partners, it's really an exciting opportunity. And really the call is for others to get involved in this program, to support this kind of data gathering and capturing, and then more importantly, making sure that it's available so that we can help use some of this approach in terms of developing metrics and targets. And I think, Renata, that's my last slide as well. So look forward to some of the questions and discussion.
Thank you so much. Wow, what a practical example of a methodology which is easy to apply. And also, it looks like that this methodology, the eDNA, can support companies to access their biodiversity level with factual data, right? Because it's the DNA of the individuals, organisms out there that we can assess with this methodology. So that's great. And another aspect very interesting is that what I'm understanding is that you can use this data to feed in this global biodiversity database, which we know is a gap we have nowadays in many cases. So that's very, very impressive. Thank you so much. So the last speaker, last but not least, Liudmila from AXA, over to you.
Thank you very much, Renata, and thank you very much to all the previous speakers, because actually a lot has been said. I will try to summarize everything and provide a financial institutions perspective on nature-related data and metrics. So I will talk about what stimulates financial institutions today to use nature-related data and metrics, and then I will also talk about the problems for financial institutions to choose the correct, well, the right data and metrics in order to be able to effectively contribute to nature protection. So there are several drivers, the 3 key ones that actually stimulate financial institutions today to consider biodiversity and nature protection and to start integrating these issues into their sustainability strategies and approaches. So the first driver is related to the fact that we, thanks to scientists, we actually have an actual concrete issue to tackle. So we know that nature degradation is a scientific fact. We know what causes nature degradation today. We know that most of it is caused by human social and economic activities, and we can even identify those activities which contribute the most to nature degradation and the aspects of these activities. The second driver would be the fact that there is an increase in progress in terms of availability of data, metrics, and tools, and these data metrics and tools are becoming more and more adapted to the financial institutions' use cases, which are quite specific sometimes. So financial institutions actually can act on biodiversity, can start acting on biodiversity and nature protection right now. And the third driver would be surely the regulatory developments. And there is a clear regulatory momentum today, and financial institutions, just like corporates, need to ensure compliance with existent laws on environment protection and the coming laws, standards, and regulation. So there is a clear interest for financial institutions to act on biodiversity and nature protection, but each of these drivers that I presented presents also some key challenges. So it's not so easy for financial institutions to find their way in the nature protection topic today. So sure, the first driver is the fact that we actually have concrete issues to tackle. Thank you very much to Thomas for reminding us the global definition of biodiversity provided by the International Convention. However, there is still a terminology problem because different organizations, different standards, different legal texts, different economic agents, they may use completely different definitions and terms as regards nature and biodiversity. We may find solutions that focus specifically on species, or specifically on genes, or specifically on opportunities related to nature, etc. So there is a lot of different terms existing today, and actually we need clarity in order to make sure that financial institutions, corporates, and all the private sector, together with the public sector actually today, knows what we're talking about and knows concretely, and we share the same terms and the same definitions. And I think that TNFD is doing this quite well, because this is one of the key jobs of the TNFD to provide clear definitions and terms. So we're expecting this work will continue. Well, the second key challenge related to the second driver. So sure, we noticed today an increase in availability of data, metrics, and tools specific to nature. However, with the variety of these metrics, KPIs, and indicators, the question pop-ups, and this question is what metric to choose and to use. And the choice of metric is a key challenge that we need to tackle altogether. I will talk about it later on the second slide. And the last driver, regulatory momentum. Sure, it stimulates a lot the action of financial institutions on biodiversity and nature protection. However, at the same time, we see today that different legal texts sometimes push financial institutions and corporates in different directions. So there is no complete harmonization between different legal texts, regulation, and standards, including industry standards that are appearing today. So there is a clear need to, kind of harmonize and align in the stimuli for financial institutions to understand where to go clearly under the data constraints that we're experiencing today, and in order still to respond to the clear scientific imperative to tackle biodiversity loss and nature degradation. Next slide, please. Still, in this context of uncertainties, financial institutions, despite this context of uncertainties, financial institutions still are working on development of nature-related solutions and approaches, and more financial institutions today start using nature-specific metrics and even think about setting up nature-specific targets in the near future. But before going to targets, we still need to deal with the choice of metrics, and this is the key element, I think, for TNFD, but also for every market agent, for every economic agent, corporate or financial institution today, what metrics to choose. And there are a lot of questions around this point, but I would put forward two key ones according to myself. So it's my opinion, I hope you share it. One of the key questions about the choice of metrics would be this related to this dilemma, which I call narrow down or broaden up. It means that we know all that biodiversity and nature is a huge challenge with a lot of different elements and sub-issues within it. So it's a very complex topic. So at some point, while choosing metrics, we need to broaden up in order to be sure that the metrics that we choose cover all the relevant aspects of biodiversity and nature. So the list of metrics may be quite wide in this case, to be sure that it is comprehensive. So once we get a comprehensive list of metrics, then we need to narrow down it, because for our action to be efficient, it should be actually measured, its efficiency, its results should be measured based on some very concrete and a limited list of indicators. So there is a narrow down, broaden up dilemma. So do we need a lot of different indicators, very bottom up, very close to the ground on biodiversity and nature, or do we need some kind of, a mix or some kind of a balanced selection of metrics? And I think that this is one of the key questions that should be solved by the TNFD in Better Framework 3, the coming one. And the second question would be the dashboard approach versus one single metric to cover biodiversity and nature. This question relates to the fact that today we start seeing new approaches to biodiversity and nature are being developed. These approaches, in many cases, offer solutions, very aggregatable and aggregated solutions of measuring biodiversity and nature. It means that instead of having a very long list of very close to the ground indicators and very detailed indicators, instead of this list, we may have only one single measurement unit, only one indicator, which will in some case aggregate and englobe all the other indicators. So the question would be, should we have this dashboard and bottom-up approach and follow each issue of biodiversity loss and nature degradation separately and very specifically, or can we aggregate all it in one single metric and then optimize this one single metric? So this is one of the key challenges that I'm seeing today on the market for financial institutions, but I think for corporates as well. And once we deal with this, then we could probably think about how to adapt our choice of metrics to target setting. And one of the key challenges that financial institutions are seeing today in terms of target setting is the question, actually, what do such global targets as no net biodiversity loss by 2030 or full recovery of nature by 2050 or nature positive, what do these global targets actually mean concretely in terms of concrete actions by each company, each sector, each industry, including financial institutions? And I think that there is clear expectation from the SBTN, but also from the COP15 later this year to clarify this point, and then we'll need to adapt the choice of our metrics to the trajectories and the targets in their detail. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liudmila. Wow, a couple of challenges we need to solve. And I think you mentioned some key ones. I think one in the definition, I fully with you. I think many of the people in the call are also agreeing on that. So biodiverse nature, how can we define, are these the same thing or different, and so on and so forth. The other one on the metrics, quite a difficult one as well, which metric to choose. But I think the key to the discussion is to see that financial institutions they are willing to take in account biodiversity, not only climate, which makes me happier, and also I think together with SBTN and TNFD, the way that they're approaching this, like involving many institutions, organizations, and NGOs, financial institutions, corporate, and so on, I think we will find a solution together. I'm optimistic. Thank you so much. Okay, I think we are ready for the Q&A. We have so many questions. I'm going to start with one that I think I'm going to address this one, I think, to Thomas, but the other speakers, you please feel free to jump in. But because it's about the star, I think I'm addressing to Thomas. So the question is, I can see the value of star to monitor the status of nature and as a screening tool. However, the resolution of 5 kilometers square making it very difficult to apply to specific business actions. A change in star metrics at 5 kilometers square could be due to any number of reasons and not specific to the specific activity of a single business. So he just welcome your view on this.
Great, thanks Renata, and thanks Mark for the excellent question. Three main responses. First of all, as I mentioned, STAR as formulated and as currently available is an estimated STAR that's based on the global data as mentioned. There's work underway to put in place the methods to provide a calibrated and ultimately a realized version of STAR that would be informed also with local data. So, for example, from the results of eDNA surveys, the kind of work that Warwick was describing, to provide a calibrated version. I'm not so concerned about the scale dimension there. It's kind of hard to think of activities at a sub 5 kilometer resolution that would be driving global extinction risk. Maybe you can think of some for extremely tiny micro endemics restricted to a single spring or something. But I think that for most corporate activities, 5 kilometers will actually be picking up things up reasonably in terms of spatial resolution. And then finally, the metric isn't actually dependent on the resolution itself. So it would be feasible as higher resolution imagery become available, remotely sensed imagery become available, to derive higher resolution versions even of estimated STAR. But I think that the development of the calibrated version and incorporation of local data is the key point to address your question. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. Another one, I address one for Varsha. The question is, SBTN was extending the in-core data for impacts and dependencies. Do you have any updates on new upcoming versions of this file?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So we will actually be going out for a public consultation. That means an opportunity for the public to engage with our methodology in mid-September. In that release, we'll have a new version of the sectoral materiality tool that has an extension on the impact side of this. The dependencies is still something that is in development and is not currently present in the data set, but there will be an improvement and expansion of that tool that we look forward to hearing feedback on.
Very good. Next question, I think I'm going to address maybe for Laura or Emily. But okay, panelists, please feel free to jump in. So the question is there a current discussion of joining the three ways of measuring biodiversity into one geospatial database? For example, eDNA, ecosystem, species, delineation, etc.
Thanks, Renata. Yeah, this is exactly the kind of big picture question with it that TNFD is sort of wrestling with other partners within which our work fits, because obviously there's been a really rich discussion of different measurement and target setting approaches and case studies of applying them. The TNFD framework then potentially, through its disclosure recommendations and application of the LEAP approach, could generate further data and measurement. You could imagine, Warwick, your example with environmental DNA, as more people are applying that, where does the data sit? Could it and should it be shared externally to then enrich the data sets that metrics like STAR and others can be built upon? So that's something we're actively discussing. There are others, many others, including, of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity as our overall global umbrella as a planet for setting these rules. So we're thinking about this and initiatives to think about databases within which it sits. TNFD is just one part of that. So we, as a task force, talking about what could go into the framework and the disclosure recommendations to encourage and enable people to apply this and to share it, rather than building a database ourselves, looking to others and discussing with others about what might be built and how we can incentivize the application of all of this. So we think a database is a great idea. We know others are discussing it. There are many databases out there, and we hope to generate more uptake and demand to feed into those initiatives.
Very good. Thank you, Emily. Clear. Now on to Warwick. Is it fair to say that the eDNA can help set baselines? Can it also then track changes in species over time? Would this be done every year or less often?
Yeah, thanks, Renata. I mean, I think there were a number of other questions around, how do we use eDNA? Do we see this as replacing some of the traditional methods? And I think not. I mean, I think it's really a sort of a basket of tools approach that we need to apply. But yes, I mean, it is an incredibly powerful way in order to one, detect presence and absence. I know there are a couple of questions around abundance as well, and I think Doug has answered a few of those in the chat as well. But it certainly does help, and in particular, if we think about some of the applications that we've used. So, for example, in our geosciences and discovery teams, where there are no baselines, where they're going into areas where there's literally nothing to go on other than what you can potentially get off a desktop survey or a site like an IUCN Red List or using the STAR or IBAT. So getting a quick sample and using that to then augment that baseline is a fantastic way to say, let's build the best baseline we can get right from the get-go, so that we can monitor progress and change to say, well, what's driving these pressures? What is the driver of change? And if we can make sure that we can change that or influence that, that's obviously something that we would use. So it definitely does help support, but it's not as if it's going to replace a lot of your traditional methods.
Very good, very clear. Next one for Liudmila. To what extent is it a barrier for financial institutions to track the location-specific nature impact of their operations? What tools already exist to precisely track location-specific operations?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and actually we have a lot of different technical constraints and data availability constraints in terms of and technical. When I say technical, it doesn't relate only to data, but also it also relates to the systems that financial institutions are using internally. So this is a big point on which we need to advance as financial institutions altogether, the whole financial sector, especially for the listed assets, for the listed companies. We currently do not have information on geographical location of companies, in many cases beyond their headquarters or main production sites or main distribution sites. Sometimes data is aggregated on the regional level. You have only a country. Sometimes it is you have big cities for big distribution or production sites, and that's it. So this is a real challenge for operations, and it's even a bigger challenge for supply chain and distribution. So yeah, We start having some solutions, geolocation ones. We also are very much dependent on what companies actually can report. And we need to drive the reporting in this space.
Very good. One more question to Varsha, and I think Emily can also complement. So it's great that we are finally agreeing on a way forward to best measure biodiversity and set targets to reverse biodiversity loss. Will SBTN and TNFD be providing methodologies and case studies to help with nature restoration efforts?
So I'm happy to take this from the SBTN side. Our goal is very much to have targets which focus on actions which increase positive impacts on nature, therefore focusing on restoration across systems. In the first release of our SBTN methodologies to come in Q1 2023, we'll be particularly focusing on the terrestrial domain, but hopefully as time goes on and we iterate on these methods, we'll have coverage across the realms so that we very much join the avoid and reduction parts of nature impacts with positive impacts induced by restoration in line with global goals for restoration.
Emily, do you want to complement?
Yes, definitely. So agree. So the TNFD framework is developing in line with SBTNs to focus not only on reducing negative pressures on the environment, but also increasing the positives, including both conservation and restoration. We know that from Tom and others' work that conservation can be effective, leaving nature alone allows it to regenerate, but also active restoration. And that's feeding into both our thinking about impacts, having both negative impacts, but also positive impacts. The potential, our framework must reflect the ability to move to the positives too. And also we're now actively thinking in this next phase with the task force about risks and opportunities. So opportunities for restoration is a key category in our framework.
Very good. Now I'm going to pose a question to anyone can answer, okay? So has anyone looked at the most usable metrics to support a regional, national, or global voluntary biodiversity offset market? Anyone? Maybe you.
Voluntary biodiversity offsets. Was that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, some of what we've tried to do is to actually have a look at what, almost an in-setting approach in terms of what we have available within either tenements or mining license or lease areas that we have, and making sure that we can almost get a co-benefit value out of it. So a lot of the work done recently around, in the carbon space as an example, is traditionally sort of overlooked what the biodiversity co-benefit is. And so it's really made us look more closely at not only the areas and the regions in which we operate, but also the lands that we either have title or management over, and to look at those biodiversity and carbon co-benefits, because I think there are. Getting to a biodiversity market, I mean, I think it's probably still early days, but there's definitely a lot of interest around a sort of a biodiversity credit or a biodiversity token system to say, if you can demonstrate that you can provide a gain over time, whether it's a piece of degraded land that's either related to your impact, or if it's a piece of land that you've identified almost as a nature positive opportunity, if you can demonstrate that there's an uplift over time, then why not have some of that credit potentially available within a sort of a credit scheme or a token scheme. So yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of movement in that space. Yeah,
I fully agree.
And in terms of specific metrics, I think this relates to, I see there's been a lot of discussion in the chat here around the importance of multiple metrics, for example, metrics for genetic diversity and species and ecosystems sitting alongside each other. I think that would very much apply in the context of offsets here. I'll also put the link into the chat here of the IUCN policy on biodiversity offsets, which, while it doesn't speak to that question on metrics for supporting offset implementation, maybe helps with the general context there. Thanks.
Thomas, let's continue with you. A question directed to you. STAR can help identify potential impact and risk, as well as potential benefits of different responses. Can it also track actual changes in the state of nature due to different responses?
Great, thanks, thanks Renata, and thanks Nadine for the question there. So yes, and this actually relates back to the earlier point about the importance of bringing local data to bear within the overall global metric, and so we are in the process of developing not just a calibrated but also a realized version of STAR to actually allow tracking change over time. That can't be done from the estimated global version available at the moment, but with local data coming to the table, that would then be possible.
Very good. And then there is one here from Raymond that may be also for Emily to answer, but please feel free if the panelists want to answer. But the question is, there is a lot of data available at operational level, but there is no clear standard to cover local data to consistent normalized metrics. One example being water. There is no clear alignment on reporting standards. It is a moving target with corporate aggregations acting as a screen to opaque local effects. What's your view on this?
Did you want me to have a first go, Renata?
I think so.
I'm happy to. So the first thing I just want to emphasize is that the TNFD framework is a work in progress, as I'm sure you said at the beginning in your framing, and learning from other standards. So in developing the first draft approach to metrics in the last beta release, we based that on a landscape assessment of what other metrics were out there. And we found that there are many in existing standards, but actually you can see that they cluster around certain themes. So we're certainly pushing towards having stronger alignment, and many of our knowledge partners, SBTN and IUCN and knowledge partners, we also work with the main standards organizations, both voluntary ones like CDP and GRI, but also those like FRAG that are in development as European mandatory standards. So we're moving towards alignment. And then in terms of the local level, one of the things we emphasized in our last release, we didn't give all the answers and the solutions, but called on partners to help us, is the need for this alignment between the global scale for measurement and targets, CBD at that level setting the global targets and needing a clear measurement approach there that's consistent then at national level, where national countries are systematically applying that down to the local level for ecosystem condition assessment and the diversity of those ecosystems and the species and genes within them. So we know not only we, also SBTN and others need to have consensus at those global to local scales. That's in all of our interests to enable, and it's a theme coming through in the Q&A, the need for consistent frameworks, clarity and greater consensus. Not one metric is coming through in the chat, but certainly consensus on what the dashboard should be and consolidation of that. So that's again something we and TNFD require others do to help this to be applicable and scalable, and having many conversations with our forum members and partners on how to do that.
Very good. Varsha, do you want to complement?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Emily, for really setting that up. SBTN is also, again, an iterative methodology. So we'll be releasing the version 1, and that includes a set of freshwater target setting methods. And so that kind of addresses the question that was asked here about how to decide which local metrics are relevant, how to kind of wade through the differences in those methodologies. And what's kind of unique about the SBTN approach is that we have guidance in how to determine an appropriate metric. So there may not be a single metric for every single place. There's a reason to kind of incorporate local context in the evaluation of nature's impacts, as well as the appropriate actions. So if you think about the things that a company can do as a portfolio of things that include conservation actions, restoration actions, and those which reduce impacts on nature, then there will be metrics that are specifically appropriate to those kinds of actions. And the guidance provided in SBTN kind of toes a line between things that are prescriptive, that provide you an exact pathway through, often relying on global data. But as we've heard, there can be issues with global data and gaps and kind of blind sites in those type of approaches. And so the value of local approaches and local calibration of models is huge. But we need guidance on the company side of how to know whether that approach, whether that model is really fit for purpose. And that's guidance that we're providing within the methodology. And we look forward to feedback from companies about where additional clarity is needed in terms of deciding what models to use and what data to use when.
Very good. Maybe we have one more question and then we have to wrap up. For Liudmila, I have one here. For AXA, what actions, if any, are investors already taking to overcome nature-related risks?
Thank you very much for this question. This is a really good one and probably the most difficult one for financial institutions today, because we start having information, data, and methodologies on impacts, dependencies start being developed today. Our opportunity side is also something that we try to figure out, but nature-related risks is a big challenge for financial institutions. And there is a difference between institutional investors and asset managers. This is the difference that we may make I would make in my response, because for some categories of institutional investors like insurance companies, it may be a little bit more easier to track some of the nature-related risks, like physical risks, for example, because they do have already models to track climate-related physical risks. So there is a natural extension to to integrate into the existing models more global nature-related risks. But transition risks is a real challenge, and asset managers actually do not have sufficient information today at all to modelize any financial impacts related to any concrete financial impacts related to nature degradation. We have some very, very broad proxies that some global figures stating that it may be a problem for one sector in one region. But this part of nature degradation approach is still to develop.
Very good, thank you, Liudmila. All right, so thank you all for coming and staying to the end. Thank you also for the brilliant speakers to share you guys' experience and practical experience as well, and expertise with all of us on metrics and targets. I think we have a huge challenge in front of us, but the good thing is that we are not just listening. We are doing some actions. We are trying to solve some of this challenge together with TNFD. Hope we get to a solution soon. So there are a couple of things I want to tell is that the next forum webinar, the invite for September will be sent shortly. And also, as mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the recording will be shared in the next Forum Insights newsletter. So you guys will all have the recording as soon as possible. Thank you so much for everyone, and have a nice end of the day or beginning of the day, depending where you are. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you very much.
Thank you.